The ground trembled beneath his boots as Sergeant Daniel Carter moved carefully through the ruined city. Smoke curled from collapsed buildings, and the scent of burned metal filled the air. His rifle was steady in his grip, scanning the area for threats. He was behind enemy lines, deep within alien-controlled territory, and every step could mean the difference between life and death. The war between humans and the Auxiliary Empire had lasted for years, but this mission was different. His orders were simple: gather intelligence and escape undetected. But nothing ever went according to plan in war. As he rounded a corner, he froze. Standing in the middle of the rubble was an alien woman, her deep violet skin illuminated by the flickering fires around them. She wore intricate armor, unlike the standard Auxiliary soldiers he had fought before. Her silver eyes widened in shock as she turned to face him. A princess. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to raise his weapon. Auxiliary royalty were known to be dangerous strategists, and her presence here was a mystery. But she didn't move. She didn't run. Instead, she held herself still, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. He could see it in her stance. She was afraid. Princess Serenia Vaughn had been trained for diplomacy, not war. She had visited many battlefields, but never stood face to face with an armed human soldier. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she forced herself to remain calm. The human's golden brown eyes locked onto hers, sharp and unreadable. She expected hostility, maybe an attack. Instead, he simply watched her, his grip firm on his weapon but not yet firing. "You're not supposed to be here," Daniel finally said, his voice low and steady. Serenia swallowed. She had been separated from her guards during a surprise attack. Calling for help now would alert her warriors, but something inside her hesitated. This human, he was different from the one she had seen before. He was calculating, calm, and cautious, but not reckless. Before she could respond, a loud explosion echoed through the streets. Both of them instinctively ducked as debris rained down. In the distance, an alien patrol was approaching. Serenia's mind raced. If her soldiers found him here, he would be executed immediately. Daniel exhaled sharply. He was trapped. She turned back to him, her fingers twitching at her side. She had to make a decision. Did she call for help, or did she do something unthinkable? Trust a human. Before she could answer her own question, Daniel spoke again. "If you don't want to die here, you'd better come with me." Serenia inhaled sharply. The idea was unthinkable, yet for some reason, she didn't refuse. As the sound of footsteps drew closer, she made her choice. She followed the human soldier into the shadows. Serenia followed Sergeant Daniel Carter through the ruins, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with dust, the sounds of alien patrols growing louder behind them. Every step she took with the human soldier felt unreal. She was a princess, meant to command armies, not flee like a fugitive. Daniel moved silently, his eyes sharp and focused. He had survived countless battles, but this was something new. He was escaping behind enemy lines with an alien princess, a situation he never imagined. They slipped into a collapsed building, pressing against the cold walls. Daniel glanced at Serenia. She was breathing fast, struggling to hide her nervousness. "Are they looking for you?" he asked in a low voice. Serenia hesitated. "Yes." Daniel exhaled. That was bad news. If the Auxiliary soldiers found them, they wouldn't ask questions. They would attack first. "We can't stay here," he muttered, peeking out through a broken window. The patrol was searching nearby, their voices sharp in their alien tongue. Serenia watched him carefully. Humans were supposed to be reckless and weak, yet this one moved like a predator, his body ready for action at any moment. She clenched her fists. Why was she trusting him? "Follow me," Daniel said, moving quickly toward a narrow alley. Serenia followed, her steps light and careful. As they reached an abandoned street, she finally spoke. "You could have killed me back there. Why didn't you?" Daniel gave her a sideways glance. "Killing you wouldn't have helped me survive." His answer surprised her. Humans were always described as violent, yet this one chose logic over aggression. They reached a small, hidden bunker, likely an old human outpost from an earlier battle. Daniel pushed open a rusty door, and they slipped inside. The air was damp and stale, but at least it was safe for now. Serenia leaned against the wall, crossing her arms. "You seem different from other human soldiers I've seen." Daniel sat on a crate, checking his supplies. "And you don't act like a spoiled princess," he replied without looking at her. She narrowed her eyes. "I am not spoiled." He smirked. "Could have fooled me." Silence filled the room. Serenia took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She was in enemy territory with a human, a dangerous situation. She studied him closely. Why wasn't she afraid? Outside, the sounds of soldiers faded into the distance. They were safe for now, but Serenia knew it wouldn't last. Daniel finally looked at her. "Your people think humans are monsters, don't they?" She hesitated, then nodded. He chuckled. "Well, guess you'll have to decide for yourself." For the first time, Serenia felt uncertain about everything she had been taught. She wasn't sure if this human was her enemy or something else entirely. Serenia sat against the cold metal wall of the bunker, watching the human soldier with quiet curiosity. Sergeant Daniel Carter was unlike any human she had ever seen before. He wasn't reckless or aggressive. He was calm, calculating, and strangely patient. Daniel checked his ammunition and supplies, his movements precise and methodical. The room was silent except for the distant echoes of battle outside. They were safe, for now. "You're staring," Daniel said without looking up. Serenia blinked, caught off guard. "I am only observing." He smirked. "Same thing." She frowned. "Humans are unpredictable. I am trying to understand how you think." Daniel glanced at her. "And?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "You fight differently than my people. Humans should not survive against the Xilari, yet you do. Why?" Daniel leaned back against a crate, thinking for a moment. "Because we don't give up." Serenia narrowed her eyes. "That is not a strategy. That is foolishness." He chuckled. "Maybe. But it's why we're still here." She studied him, frustrated yet intrigued. The Xilari followed strict battle tactics, relying on superior numbers and technology. Humans, however, were unpredictable. They adapted, refused to accept defeat, and somehow always found a way to survive. Serenia looked at his face. There were small scars, signs of past battles. His eyes, though calm, carried the weight of experience. "You have seen many wars," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "Too many." She was about to ask more when he suddenly stood up and grabbed his weapon. His entire posture changed, tense, alert, ready. Serenia followed his gaze toward the door. Footsteps. Her breath caught. "They found us." Daniel motioned for her to stay quiet. He moved silently, his steps almost soundless. The bunker had only one entrance, and if soldiers were outside, they were trapped. Serenia's heartbeat quickened. She had never been in a situation like this. Normally, her guards would handle threats, but now her survival depended on a human. Daniel pressed against the door, listening. After a few seconds, he exhaled. "It's just one. Might be a scout." Serenia clenched her fists. If the scout reported back, an entire squad would arrive soon. Daniel turned to her. "Can you fight?" She lifted her chin. "I am trained in combat." He handed her a small knife. "Then be ready." The door creaked open, and a shadow moved inside. Without hesitation, Daniel struck first, his reflexes sharp. The scout barely had time to react before he was disarmed and pinned to the ground. Serenia watched, stunned. Human speed was terrifying. Daniel pressed a hand over the scout's mouth, looking at Serenia. "Your call, princess. What do we do with him?" She hesitated. This was her enemy. But was she ready to give the order? The choice was hers. Serenia stared at the auxiliary scout, his eyes wide with panic as Daniel held him down with ease. The human's strength was undeniable. She had always believed her people were superior, yet in this moment, she saw just how dangerous humans could be. Daniel's grip remained firm as he whispered, "Your call, Princess. What do we do with him?" Her mind raced. If they let him go, he would report their location, and an entire squad would be upon them within minutes. If they silenced him permanently. She shook her head, clearing the thought. That was not her way. "We tie him up," she said firmly. Daniel raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. He quickly used some torn fabric to bind the scout's hands and feet before placing a cloth over his mouth. The alien squirmed, but he couldn't do much. "He'll be found soon," Daniel muttered. "We need to move. Now." Serenia nodded, and they slipped out of the bunker, moving swiftly through the shadows of the ruined city. The air was thick with tension. Every step felt like a gamble. Daniel led the way, his senses sharp. He moved with the silent confidence of a warrior, his instincts keeping them away from open spaces. Serenia followed, trying to ignore the way her heart pounded. Her people had always described humans as chaotic and reckless, but Daniel was neither. He was controlled, careful, and focused. They reached an alleyway, taking a moment to rest behind a crumbling wall. Daniel checked their surroundings before looking at her. "You've never been on the battlefield alone, have you?" he asked. Serenia exhaled. "No, I was always protected." He smirked. "Bet that's changing fast." She frowned. "I am not weak, human." "Never said you were," he replied. "But out here, instincts matter more than titles." Before she could respond, a sharp sound echoed in the distance. A warning signal. Daniel's expression darkened. They found the scout. Serenia tensed. That meant soldiers were on their way. "We have to run," she said. Daniel nodded. "Stay close." They took off through the ruins, moving as quickly as they could. Behind them, the sounds of armored boots striking the ground grew louder. The auxiliary were fast, but so were humans. Serenia's lungs burned as she ran beside him. She had never fled like this before, never felt the fear of being hunted. It was terrifying. And yet, the human beside her didn't falter. Daniel suddenly grabbed her wrist, pulling her behind a collapsed building just as a group of auxiliary soldiers rushed past. They held their breath, staying perfectly still. For the first time in her life, Serenia realized something shocking. She wasn't afraid because of the human. She was alive because of him. Serenia pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her breaths shallow and controlled. The enemy patrol had passed, but she knew they would come back. The auxiliary never left a search unfinished. Beside her, Sergeant Daniel Carter stayed perfectly still, his sharp eyes scanning the ruins. He listened carefully, his breathing even, his posture relaxed yet ready for action. Serenia envied that. How could a human be so calm in a life-or-death situation? After a long, tense moment, Daniel finally spoke. "They're moving farther away. We need to go before they circle back." Serenia nodded, still feeling the rush of adrenaline in her veins. They crept through the shattered remains of buildings, stepping lightly to avoid making noise. Every turn felt dangerous. Every shadow felt like a trap. After what felt like an eternity, they reached an abandoned structure, partially buried under debris. It looked unstable, but at this moment, they had no choice. Daniel pushed open a metal door, revealing a dark interior. "We'll rest here for a bit." Serenia hesitated before stepping inside. The place smelled of rust and dust, but at least it was safe. Daniel sat on the ground, checking his supplies. His movements were quick and efficient, a soldier who had done this 100 times before. Serenia watched him. She had seen warriors prepare for battle before, but this was different. The auxiliary fought with strategy and formations. Humans fought with instinct and survival. "You are very different from what I expected," she admitted. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Oh, thought I'd be some kind of wild brute." She hesitated. My people say humans are reckless, emotional, and violent. Daniel smirked. And what do you think? Serenia paused, thinking about everything she had seen so far. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't emotional, at least not in the way she expected. And while he was dangerous, he was not mindlessly violent. I think, she said slowly, you are more than what I was taught. Daniel chuckled. Glad you're figuring that out. Silence filled the room. Outside, the distant sounds of war continued. Serenia sighed and leaned against the wall, her body exhausted. This was not how she imagined this mission going. She looked at Daniel again. How do you stay so calm? He glanced at her, then shrugged. Panic doesn't help. You keep your head down, think, and do what needs to be done. His words were simple, yet they carried a deep truth. Serenia had spent her life training in diplomacy, in controlling emotions, and maintaining royal composure. But this was different. This was survival. For the first time, she realized that she had a lot to learn from this human. And something told her, this was only the beginning. The hours passed slowly in the dimly lit bunker, and the air grew thick with tension. Outside, the sounds of battle raged on. But for a moment, Serenia and Sergeant Daniel Carter found a fragile peace. The wreckage of war surrounded them, but inside this hidden shelter, it felt almost calm. Daniel checked his gear one last time, making sure everything was ready. Serenia sat across from him, lost in thought. The weight of her situation pressed down on her. She was supposed to be the one in control, but right now, she was a princess who had to rely on a human soldier for survival. Daniel's voice broke the silence. We need to move soon. The Exilari will regroup, and they'll be coming for us. Serenia nodded, her fingers unconsciously tracing the markings on her armor. She was used to being in charge, but every step she took now was uncertain. The trust she was learning to place in Daniel was something she had never imagined before. As they prepared to leave, something caught her attention. A faint sound, a quick rustling from outside. Her senses immediately went on alert. Stay here, she whispered to Daniel, her voice low and controlled. He nodded, his hand gripping his weapon. But before Serenia could move, the door burst open, and several alien soldiers rushed in. They were too fast, too well coordinated. Serenia's heart skipped a beat. They had been followed. Daniel spun toward her, eyes wide with shock. Ambush, he hissed. The soldiers quickly surrounded them, their weapons raised. Serenia's hand instinctively went to her blade, but she hesitated. The soldiers weren't aiming at her. They were targeting Daniel. Drop your weapon, human, one of the auxiliary soldiers commanded, their voice cold and unyielding. Serenia felt a rush of confusion and anger. Why weren't they attacking her? But before she could respond, she saw a familiar figure step forward. Her heart sank as she recognized the face of the soldier who had helped them escape earlier. The same soldier Daniel had tied up. You? Serenia whispered, stunned. The traitor smiled cruelly. I told you, princess, you should never trust humans. The room seemed to spin as the weight of the betrayal hit her. The human soldier she had learned to trust was no different from the rest of them. Daniel's eyes narrowed. You betrayed us? He asked, his voice full of disbelief. The traitor didn't flinch. The price for your capture was too good to ignore. The Exilari pay well for royal prisoners. Serenia's breath caught in her throat. She had been so wrong. She had let her guard down, believing that Daniel, this human soldier, had truly cared. But it was all a lie. The traitor took a step forward, motioning to the soldiers. You're both coming with us. Daniel's gaze flickered between the traitor and Serenia, his hand still gripping his weapon. He didn't say a word, but the tension in his stance was clear. He was waiting for the right moment. Serenia's mind raced. She had no weapon, no backup. She was trapped. And worse, she had been betrayed by someone she thought was her ally. Get ready, Daniel muttered quietly. Serenia's mind raced as she stood still, caught in the middle of the tension. The alien soldiers surrounded them, weapons aimed squarely at Daniel. The man who had helped her survive so far was now their target, and for a fleeting moment, she felt helpless. She had been trained to command armies and negotiate treaties, not to navigate situations like this. Yet now, the choice lay squarely in her hands. Daniel's eyes locked on hers, his expression steady. "Princess," he said softly, keeping his voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "If you have a plan, now's the time." She clenched her fists, trying to ignore the way her chest tightened. These were her people, after all. They were supposed to protect her. But the sight of the alien soldiers, their cold expressions and ready weapons, made her hesitate. "They will kill you," she whispered back, her voice barely audible. "Maybe," Daniel replied, his grip firm on his rifle. "But if you let them take control, you'll never get another chance to make your own decisions." The words hit her harder than she expected. Daniel had no reason to fight for her. He could have run when the soldiers arrived, but he had stayed. And now, the choice wasn't about loyalty to her people, it was about what was right. Serenia straightened her back, forcing herself to meet the soldiers' gazes. "Lower your weapons," she said firmly, her voice commanding. The lead soldier, the one who had betrayed them, laughed. "You can't be serious. This human is the enemy. He's the reason we're even in this mess. Why would you protect him?" "I said, lower your weapons," she repeated, her tone unwavering. The room fell silent. The soldiers exchanged uncertain looks. They were bound by loyalty to their princess, but the order seemed unthinkable. The traitor narrowed his eyes. "You can't protect him forever, princess. Your people, our people, will never accept this. They will see it as weakness." Serenia felt a flicker of doubt, but Daniel's steady presence reminded her of the truth. He had saved her life more than once. He had proven that not all humans were reckless killers. "If you disobey me now," Serenia said slowly, her voice cutting through the room, "you will face the consequences. Stand down." "That is an order." The soldiers hesitated, their weapons wavering. Finally, one by one, they lowered their rifles. The tension in the room lifted slightly, though the unease lingered. The traitor, however, remained defiant. "You'll regret this," he muttered. Serenia ignored him and stepped closer to Daniel. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice quiet now. "We need to leave." Daniel gave her a small nod. "Lead the way." The room was thick with tension as Serenia and Daniel made their move. The alien soldiers who had reluctantly lowered their weapons still stood frozen, unsure if they should challenge their princess's authority. Serenia, however, didn't give them a chance to reconsider. "Let's go," she said, glancing at Daniel. Without hesitation, they headed toward the bunker's side exit. The lead soldier, still brimming with anger, called after her. "You're making a mistake, princess. You're siding with the enemy." She didn't stop or look back. Serenia's mind was made up, and for once, she refused to doubt herself. Daniel had proven himself more than once. Now it was her turn to stand by him. Once outside, they moved quickly through the maze of rubble. The sound of distant gunfire and alien machinery was a constant reminder of the ongoing war. Daniel kept to the shadows, his sharp instincts steering them clear of enemy patrols. Serenia followed closely, keeping her steps light, and her gaze scanning the horizon. "How much farther?" she asked quietly. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. "A few more blocks. There's a transport hidden in a safe zone. If we reach it, we can get out of this mess." She nodded, determined. Her earlier fear had begun to fade. Now it was replaced by something stronger: purpose. But their path wasn't clear. Just as they rounded a corner, a small group of enemy soldiers appeared ahead. They hadn't spotted them yet, but it was only a matter of time. Daniel froze, holding up a hand. Serenia stopped instantly, her heart pounding. "What's the plan?" she whispered. Daniel looked around quickly. "We can't fight them head on. We need to draw them away. Serenia's mind raced. She was no soldier, but she understood strategy. If I step out, they'll follow me, she suggested. Daniel's expression darkened. And leave you defenseless. No chance. I'll keep my distance, she said firmly. They won't risk hurting me. They'll chase, and you can slip past. Then I'll meet you at the safe zone. It was a risky move, but there wasn't time to argue. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Stay out of their range. Run fast. And if you see me take off, follow from a distance. Serenia gave a curt nod and stepped out from their cover. Immediately, the enemy soldiers snapped to attention. Recognizing her, they hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. She took a step back, then another, and the soldiers instinctively moved forward. She's alone, one of them shouted. Just as planned, they gave chase. Serenia turned and ran, leading them away from the shadows where Daniel was waiting. Daniel didn't waste the opportunity. His focus sharpened, his movements silent. He slipped past the group and darted toward the safe zone. Serenia's breathing was heavy, but she stayed calm. The soldiers were following her, and she had to trust that Daniel would reach the transport. This time, she was fighting for more than herself. Serenia's legs burned as she pushed herself forward, leading the pursuing soldiers farther away. Her breathing was labored, but she kept her pace steady. She had no choice but to trust Daniel. He was heading to the transport, and she had to keep these soldiers distracted long enough for him to secure their escape. The terrain grew rougher, the shattered remains of once proud structures turning into jagged, unstable debris. The soldiers behind her shouted commands, trying to coordinate their movements, but she had the advantage. She knew the city's layout better than they did. In the distance, a familiar structure came into view, a small service tower she had visited years ago. If she could reach it, she could find cover and wait for Daniel to signal. The thought gave her the strength to keep moving, her feet kicking up dirt and rubble as she ran. Meanwhile, Daniel moved like a shadow. The transport was just ahead, hidden beneath a camouflage tarp. He approached carefully, scanning the area for any remaining threats. It seemed clear, but he didn't lower his guard. Years of training had taught him that an ambush could happen at any moment. Reaching the transport, he pulled back the tarp and climbed inside. The vehicle was battered but functional. Its engine hummed softly as he started it up, and a faint glow from the controls illuminated the cramped interior. Now all he needed was Serenia. Back on the run, Serenia finally ducked into the service tower. She crouched low, catching her breath and listening carefully. The soldiers' footsteps had grown fainter, their shouts more distant. She had lost them, at least for now. Her fingers brushed the communicator on her wrist. She hesitated before activating it. A part of her still couldn't believe she was relying on a human for help. But that same part of her also knew Daniel had proven himself. Over and over, he had shown strength, courage, and an unexpected honor. She pressed the button. "Carter," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "I'm clear. What's your status?" Daniel's voice came back through the crackling line. "Transport's ready. I'll pick you up near the tower. Stay put." Relief washed over her, though she quickly buried it. This wasn't over yet. When the transport arrived minutes later, she stepped out from her hiding spot. The vehicle slowed just enough for her to jump inside. Daniel glanced back at her, giving a short nod. "Nice work," he said simply. Serenia sat down, her chest still heaving. "You too." For the first time since this chaos began, she allowed herself a small smile. Despite everything, they had made it this far together. As the transport sped away from the ruined city, Serenia looked at Daniel, her respect for him growing. Whatever lay ahead, she knew they would face it as allies. The lines between enemy and friend were no longer so clear. The transport moved steadily through the desolate landscape. Daniel kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for any signs of pursuit. The auxiliary soldiers had fallen behind, at least for now, but he knew they couldn't let their guard down. Serenia sat quietly beside him, her violet eyes fixed on the ruins passing by. The tension in her body had eased somewhat, though she was far from relaxed. They had survived the ambush, but the weight of what came next was heavy on both of them. As they drove farther from the battle, the devastation around them slowly gave way to emptier terrain. The silence between them grew longer, not uncomfortable, but contemplative. Daniel broke it first. "You handled yourself well back there." Serenia turned to look at him. "You didn't think I could." He shrugged. "Not many would stand their ground like you did, especially not against their own people." Her gaze shifted to her hands. "It wasn't easy. They were my soldiers, my responsibility. But they had to be stopped. If they had taken you—" She trailed off, not finishing the thought. Daniel gave her a small nod. "You made the right call." She wanted to believe that, but doubt lingered. Would her people ever trust her again after this? Could she even return to them after siding with a human? The transport rumbled on, the faint hum of its engine the only sound. Finally, Serenia spoke again. "Your kind is different from what I was taught. You adapt, you fight, and you endure. I see now why the Xilari fear you so much." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Fear us?" "Yes," she said softly. "They call it reckless aggression, but it's not that. It's determination. You find a way, no matter how impossible it seems." He chuckled lightly. "Not always a good thing." "Perhaps not," she admitted, "but it's what kept us alive." The transport slowed as they reached a hidden outpost. Daniel brought it to a stop and turned off the engine. The quiet settled in again, but this time it felt lighter. Serenia stepped out first, taking in the barren surroundings. For the first time, she realized she wasn't thinking of her people or their expectations. She was thinking about the human beside her and how much her perspective had shifted. Daniel joined her, adjusting his gear and glancing around. "From here, you'll have to decide what to do next," he said. "Find your people, go back to your life, whatever that looks like." Serenia met his eyes, searching for something. Trust, perhaps. Gratitude, certainly. But most of all, she saw the potential for something more. An alliance that could change the way their worlds saw each other. "Maybe this is not the end," she said quietly. "Perhaps it is only the beginning." Daniel smiled faintly. "We'll see." As they prepared to part ways, neither could ignore the sense that their paths might cross again. The war wasn't over, but maybe, just maybe, the seeds of peace had been planted.